Skipper.
They say, give a man a fish, and you'll feed him for a day. Teach a man a fish, and you'll feed him for a lifetime. As Christians, we are called to be fishers of men. But our calling is not only to fish for men, but to raise up more fishermen. Exactly how to go about evangelism has been a conflict since Pentecost. Right now, the battle can be described as spiritual versus social missions. Relational missions that I'll be discussing today fall into the sweet spot between spiritual and social missions. Good evening, my name is Melanie Cooper, and I'd like to thank you for being here today. Today, I will prove that relational missions is a superior strategy of evangelism due to meeting three criteria: sustainability, reciprocality, and effectiveness. I will also refute the arguments that relational missions are not true evangelism, and that all cross-cultural evangelism, including relational missions, are a detriment to their targeted society. My first argument is that relational missions are superior in sustainability. Relational missions are missions that take individuals and communities into account when performing outreach, whether it means committing to a long-term residence and submergence in a culture, or merely cooperating with organizations that have already established a cultural base. Relational missions are superior in sustainability as they foster a culture of growth, leadership, and independent infrastructure in communities. Many in evangelical circles are aware of the detriment of passing out free money and free food on trips. However, missions that attempt to witness to people through free incentives with no real continuation strategy are harming local economies on an even greater scale. For instance, in Zambia, the clothing manufacturer, mending, and sales industry has been made entirely extinct by the donations of clothes from first world countries. Another example is Honduras. Karen Verbeek led a study that surveyed Honduran families who had homes built following Hurricane Mitch. It was discovered that the homes built by American teams, which cost approximately $30,000, were not any different from homes built by local Christian organizations who could build the same house for $2,000. Wasted money is not the real concern here. The real concern is that these missions do not follow a biblical model of labor. In Genesis 2:15, God declares that work is tov meod, or very good, and part of man's purpose here on earth is to steward the resources that God has given him. The way the church can do this is through asset-based community development. This is an umbrella term for the church stewarding the gifts and resources a community already contains. My second argument is that relational missions are superior in reciprocality. Many Western-led missions approach the materially poor as a pet project, something to be rescued. This savior complex is simply not conducive to powerful, God-honoring missions, especially because our only true savior is Jesus Christ. To be properly reciprocal, missions must consider the server and the mission target to be made in the image of God and worthy of time, careful consideration, and dignity. It is in this that relational missions excel. In researching this topic, I got to speak to Mrs. Shaw. She's a missionary here at PCC, and she's served in Kenya for decades. She told me the story about Hannah. In trying to be sustainable, Mrs. Shaw looked at the resources that Hannah already had. She was a very gifted hairstylist, and so the Shaws invested in a beauty shop for Hannah. But they didn't properly get to know Hannah's community. Within a few short weeks, the neighborhood kids began to call Hannah a witch. Their moms refused to speak to her, and when the Shaws investigated, it was discovered that the chief was corrupt. And out of jealousy for Hannah's new business and her nicer house, he had turned her community against Hannah. The Shaws tried to provide for Hannah's monetary needs, but the repercussions were that Hannah lost the most valuable need of all, human connection. There was restoration in that situation, but that's a story for another day. The current problems of short-term missions highlighted in this paper greatly result from a task-oriented and dehumanizing perspective on the peoples missionaries go to encourage and lead into the light of Christ. If the global Christian church can wake up to the Great Commission as a human-oriented process, the growth of the church can be authentic and astronomically greater than it is now. My third argument: reciprocal missions are superior in effectiveness, as they account for the way people respond to new information. When people are hungry or thirsty or naked and someone accosts them with the good news while they sit in their own filth and misery, the gospel could be corrupted by the situation of the listener. In the same vein, it is also incredibly difficult for members of a community to abandon their traditional beliefs. Relational missions must be prioritized as the church embraces this fact. For how can people see a friend in Jesus through the stranger speaking to them? Humans are infamously prone to the psychological phenomenon of confirmation bias, hearing what supports their held beliefs and tuning out any opposition. Understanding this and catering to the natural human proclivity to hear better from a known source, Relational missions can prove more effective than missions that do not take things like heritage or regional beliefs into account. A one-size-fits-all mission style just cannot compare to carefully tailored personal missions to individual communities. As Theodore Roosevelt said, no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. Even better, as it says in the Bible in James 2:14-18, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works." This can be seen in the life of Gladys Arlord. Gladys started working at a hotel in China with a woman who had already established a cultural base. Due to her service there, she was given the unique opportunity to become the official foot inspector for the region of Yangqian. Due to the new laws in China against foot binding, Gladys, with her unbound feet, would go around and make sure the laws were being upheld. This might have seemed far from evangelism that she had signed up for, but she was faithful in this opportunity, and so she was given the next opportunity, which was to speak to men in a men's prison. These men were so violent, they were not only killing each other, they were killing guards. And when Gladys was asked, she actually refused and said that it was too dangerous. But the people who she had begun building relationships with held her accountable and told her that if she had God, she did not need to fear man. And so she took up the opportunity and spoke to the men. She listened to their physical problems, how they didn't have opportunities to work, and how their living conditions were horrible. And in working with those, she was able to lead them to true salvation in Jesus. Due to people's faith in her, she became known as Ai Weida, or the Righteous One, and was able to lead over 100 orphans out of war-torn China. Now I'd like to refute some counter-arguments. Firstly, that relational missions are not true evangelism. This is an idea among believers that arises from two very different mindsets. On the evangelical argument, some Christians believe that relational missions, which they often refer to as friendship evangelism, are an excuse for Christians not to be bold for their faith, a modernist shield of friendliness to hide and the gospel. On the progressive church's side of the opposition, evangelism in all its common forms are spoken of negatively to replace with ordinary Christian living. I propose, for the answer, we look to the greatest missionary of all time, Jesus Christ. The Son of God lived and spoke among real people, speaking in parables about farming and fishing, and reacting to the beliefs of the day with the wisdom of a serpent and the gentleness of a dove. Jesus confronted the misbeliefs of a people on a personal level, even though the scope of his ministry just in the 30 years he walked on this earth far outreached anything us followers could hope to achieve, we should still strive to follow his example. Where the future of evangelism lies is in the relentless conviction and uncompromising commitment to the truth of the Bible of every follower of Christ around the globe. If Christians take up the torch of Christ, ministering to those around them, and having real conversations with those who know the Father, Christianity can step into the next centuries with hope. When Christians wake up to the Holy Spirit and boldly and openly take Christ into relationships, every one of us will become a missionary and an ambassador for God, wherever we live. My second counterargument is that all cross-cultural evangelism, including relational missions, are a detriment to the targeted society. Protests against missions are not a new phenomenon, but the reasons for it are new. Modern protests arise largely from anger over the real harm that certain professing Christians have inflicted. From waving bigoted signs to manipulating natural disasters for their own gain, evangelism has surely been perverted in the past. However, the existence of failed attempts does not invalidate godly missions. In fact, the original protests against missions arose from oppressors themselves. Christianity has been the leading force in the progression of ethics and charity in the world. Christianity has long fought against opposing forces to human life and human progress, starting with the primitive practices of child sacrifice, the oppression of women, and polygamy, to the continuing issues of abortion, marital problems, and violence. It has been said that Christian institutions are responsible for much of democratic thought present in the globalized world. Protestant missionaries have provided some of the most humanitarian efforts on both the domestic and international scale, including encouraging education, protecting indigenous peoples, fighting against colonial abuses, and advocating for equal rights across racial divides. Christians, when they embrace the relationality of the gospel, are in a unique position to encourage the growth of society. In researching this topic, I found that stories from missionaries who served in the midst of a new culture the most helpful. I read books from retired or active missionaries, spoke to a missionary, and generally looked at this topic from a personal level rather than a theoretical one. Psychology and theology as a base, and statistics for my confirmation, these real-life stories are the heart of the issue for anyone who seeks to better their mental and practical approach to missions. It was in fact stories like these that first inspired my thesis. I grew up reading about Western missionaries who had traveled to third world countries and seen miracles unimaginable here in America. I read of how these men and women gave up their entire way of living to embrace the culture of those they were with. Amy Carmichael, for instance, defied her missionary peers in deciding to wear kimono, the traditional dress of the people she served in India. Her decision came after a heartbreaking missed opportunity when she was trying to share Jesus with a questioning woman on her deathbed, but it was sidetracked by Carmichael's foreign fur-lined gloves. Exchanging the common practice of her peers enabled her to reach over hundreds of people with the gospel without any superficial distractions. I experienced something similar, but of course lesser, in Ghana this summer. I had found the girls difficult to get to know at first, and a bit reserved, until one of them, Grace, expressed interest in seeing my hair in braids. I was hesitant to do this at first, as I have a low pain tolerance, and it is very painful, but I eventually consented because I could tell how much it meant to the girls. After 4 bags of false hair, and at least 4 hours of scalping, my braids were complete. As the girls warned me, I didn't sleep at all that first night, due to pain, but it was all worth it. My new hairstyle was like a bridge between me and the girls. Not only was the actual braiding a bonding experience, but the girls finally knew my motivation in being with them. They could tell that I genuinely loved them and respected the hardships they had gone through that I could not imagine. They knew that a spoiled American girl thought that their opinion and their hair was beautiful enough to endure hours of torture for. After that, we became fast friends and talked about more interests than just hair. At the same time, those relationships were largely rooted in my braids. Your culture has more influence on your views than you think. When you are confronted with an entirely new view of life and new priorities, it can be startling and even repelling at first. Thanks to God's incredible vision for unity through diversity, healthy cultural compromise without spiritual compromise allows for 2 societies to learn from each other's failings and embrace the opportunity for growth and differences. To close on this positive note, embracing this idea can allow for explosive growth, not only of the church in the majority world, but also right here in Western culture. This thesis does not stand to dissuade the everyday Christian from participating in life-changing missions, far from it. It merely attempts to properly equip Christians to engage in domestic and international service for Christ in a way that will bring both them and the people they are serving to a better physical, emotional, and spiritual place. Christians serve and are in relationship with the triune God, which means that God himself understands the importance of relationship. It is from this fundamental nature of God that humans also have the desire to love and to create relationships. Therefore, it is in implementing this perfect structure that reflects the perfect nature of God that the church will find the most real and righteous success. Reshaping our minds to fit the biblical image of missions as outlined in the Great Commission and in the work of the apostles will take time and effort on the part of the Christian church. However, anything worth doing is worth doing well, and every person restored to God should agree that promoting this restoration for others is worth doing. Here are 2 practical ways to apply these strategies. First, while serving in an international context, Christians can make effort to source materials from local ministries, research the impact of new ideas, and listen to those with more experience in that specific field and that specific community. Missions, be they domestic or international, are not just a great idea. They are every Christian's purpose on this earth. Second, on the domestic front, a Christian must be willing to engage in meaningful conversation. The most valuable action any human being can take is to point someone in a direction that has their best eternal interest in mind, wherever they live. However, if at all possible, remain open to the unique opportunity of building relationships across cultural divides, as I hope to do as I step into adulthood. For after all, as Sir Richard Brent once said, the gladdest moment in human life, methinks, is a departure into unknown lands. Thank you. I would now like to take questions.
So I have kind of some concerns about the cost of this. The average church, I think this would be very difficult for them in terms of finances. What are your ideas on some ways that could be done through a smaller church?
Right, okay, so I understand that because a lot of this thesis is speaking about very long-term commitments to communities, but part of what small churches can do is to partner with local churches and ministries that are already in the place that they're trying to reach. So even if your church doesn't have much to offer, what they can offer is to support those local pastors and local teachers in providing the materials or whatever it is that they might need, even if that's on a smaller scale.
So how would you think it would be best, you talked about cultural competency and understanding where you're going and their views, and maybe particularly non-Western, what would be the best way for those missionaries to learn that cultural competency before they went on the mission itself?
That's a good point. I appreciate the question, and yes, definitely talking to people who might have been there or been in similar cultures is very helpful, I would think. Also, when you get there, just making sure to put yourself out there that you are willing to learn. You're not there to just talk. You want to listen, and that willingness to listen, I think, can spark the conversations that will teach you about the culture and those things.
And one last thing, what are your thoughts on potentially bringing Christians from another area here, letting them see kind of how a church or a system is run, and then allowing them to transplant back into their country? Maybe they would understand their culture better and be able to bring more followers in.
Oh yeah, I think that is a great idea, and that's very exciting. I talked about that some in my history of missions, about how the shift we're seeing in missions right now, at least in the non-Western world, is that those missionaries are actually coming to the West. Missionaries from other non-Western cultures are coming here to minister to people, and I think that is a great thing, a great new opportunity for them to learn here and teach here, and then go back to where they are and lead among their own people. Thank you.
Good evening. First of all, congratulations on a job well done. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your paper. And I will tell you that your paper actually challenged me in terms of my view of evangelism. And it brought to mind something that we do every Christmas, Operation Christmas Child, where we're stuffing those shoe boxes. And in reading your paper and in looking at the research you did, how would you revamp Samaritan's Purse and that to be more relational versus just sort of a one-time charitable action?
Great question.
Yes, so yeah, that is a very good point. And I think that maybe where the issue is that is a good first step. Those missions that are giving people what they physically need, that's a great first step. I just think there has to be something beyond that. So whether that means having those conversations with people, the people who are giving them those items that they need, if that means conversations, or if that just means starting to plant churches, I just think that can't be the end goal. It has to be the way to get into the culture, maybe, if that is like, if physical needs are really important, like we talked about in James. But I just think there has to be something sustainable beyond that.
Thank you.